"You're being let go, Alicia. Downsizing," my husband Carl said coldly, sliding the termination papers across his mahogany desk. Behind him, Heather, my former friend whom I'd recommended as his secretary, smirked with perfect red lips. I signed, without argument, and left with dignity. The next morning at the emergency board meeting, when Carl announced their engagement, I stood up with a folder in my hand. "Before congratulations are in order," I said calmly, "the board should know who actually owns controlling interest in Westlake Pharmaceuticals." Their faces when I revealed the truth made 25 years of silence worth every second. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My hands trembled as I pulled into my driveway, the familiar colonial house looming before me, the home Carl and I had shared for 23 years. The garden I'd carefully tended over decades was bursting with early summer blooms, oblivious to how my world had just imploded. Inside, I methodically removed my blazer and placed my purse on the entryway table. The house was silent. Carl wouldn't be home tonight. He'd texted that he had emergency meetings to prepare for tomorrow's board presentation. Another lie to add to the growing collection. I poured myself a glass of the expensive Cabernet we'd been saving for our anniversary next month. Somehow I doubted we'd be celebrating that milestone now. The irony wasn't lost on me that at 52, I'd just been fired from the company I helped build by the husband who was leaving me for a woman 15 years my junior. A woman I'd once considered a friend. My mind drifted back to 3 years ago when Heather Miller had reached out after our college reunion. We hadn't been close at university, but she'd seemed genuinely interested in reconnecting. Over coffee, she'd mentioned losing her job in the economic downturn. Carl mentioned needing a new executive assistant, I'd said, not recognizing the calculated look in her eyes. "With your organizational skills, you'd be perfect. I could put in a word." That single act of kindness had set everything in motion. I took my wine to the home office and unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside was a worn leather portfolio, documents I hadn't looked at in decades. Financial statements, corporate, bylaws. The original incorporation papers for what was then called Morris Medical Research, before Carl had changed the name to Westlake Pharmaceuticals during the rebranding 5 years ago. Most importantly, there was the investment agreement from 1998, signed by Carl Morris, Kenneth Westlake, and myself, Alicia Dawson Morris. The document that Carl believed had been superseded years ago, but which my attorney Sheila had carefully ensured remained legally binding through every corporate restructuring. I took another sip of wine and allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. Tomorrow's board meeting would not go as Carl and Heather expected. That morning had been surreal, sitting across from my husband of 25 years as he informed me, with clinical detachment, that my position as Director of Community Relations was being eliminated. "The reorganization requires streamlining executive positions," Carl had explained, not quite meeting my eyes. "The severance package is generous." Heather had stood slightly behind him, tablet in hand, her expression professionally sympathetic, but unable to hide the triumph in her eyes. The emerald bracelet on her wrist, the one I'd seen in Carl's desk drawer last month and assumed was my anniversary gift, glinted in the office light. "We need to focus on core competencies," she'd added, using the corporate jargon Carl had always despised until recently. "The community initiatives, while admirable, aren't driving shareholder value." The irony of her statement had almost made me laugh. If only they knew what would be driving shareholder value down by this time tomorrow. I'd maintained my composure, signed the termination agreement without argument, and walked out past stunned colleagues. Many had been with Westlake Pharmaceuticals since the beginning, since the days when we operated out of a converted warehouse with second-hand furniture and boundless hope. None of them knew what I knew. Few people remembered that Westlake Pharmaceuticals had begun as Morris Medical Research, a struggling startup with a promising patent but no capital. Fewer still knew that the initial funding hadn't come from venture capitalists or Kenneth Westlake, Carl's mentor and the company's namesake. It had come from me. My inheritance from my grandmother, every penny of the $380,000 she'd left me, had funded those first critical years. We'd kept my investment quiet at Carl's insistence. Investors and partners need to see me as the driving force, he'd explained. Having my wife as the primary investor might undermine confidence. I'd agreed, believing in his vision and our partnership. On paper, I became a minor shareholder, but Sheila had insisted on a contingency clause that would prove to be my salvation. In the event of employment termination without cause, my shares would automatically convert to voting shares at a 3-1 ratio. My phone buzzed with a text from Sheila. "Everything in place for tomorrow. 9 a.m. sharp, don't be late." I replied with a simple, "I'll be there." Then I sent another message. To Francis Douglas, chairman of the board and Carl's oldest friend. "Francis, I need to address the board before Carl's presentation tomorrow. It's urgent. Please trust me on this." His response came quickly. "Alicia, what's going on? Carl mentioned you left the company?" I typed carefully. "I didn't leave, Francis. I was terminated. Tomorrow you'll understand why that distinction matters legally." Setting my phone aside, I walked through the house, touching familiar objects, wondering which ones I'd care to keep when everything was divided. The wedding photos on the mantel, the antique clock we'd bought in Vienna, the first dollar earned, by Morris Medical, framed in Carl's study. So many memories now tainted. I climbed the stairs to our bedroom and opened the closet. Carl's side was half empty. He'd been gradually moving things to his downtown condo for months. I'd noticed but convinced myself it was for convenience on late nights. Another self-deception. In the bathroom, most of his toiletries were gone. Only his electric razor remained, the expensive one I'd given him for Christmas. How long had he been planning this? Had Heather been more than his secretary from the beginning, or had that relationship evolved over time? I thought about the board. Meeting scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow. Carl would be presenting his 5-year growth strategy, which included the announcement of his engagement to Heather, a detail I'd discovered in the presentation notes he'd carelessly left open on his laptop last week. Little did he know that Sheila had been working with Kenneth Westlake's estate attorney since his death 6 months ago. Kenneth had known about my original investment, had helped structure it to protect me, in fact. His final gift to me had been a letter revealing Carl's plans to dilute my ownership through a series of maneuvers that would have succeeded had I remained employed by the company. My termination had triggered the clause that would be Carl's undoing. Packed an overnight bag and left a note on the kitchen counter. "Staying at the lake house tonight. We'll talk after tomorrow's meeting." As I drove toward the secluded property that had been my sanctuary over the years, I felt a strange calm settle over me. 25 years of marriage was ending, but something else, something truthful, was about to begin. Tomorrow would change everything. The Westlake Pharmaceuticals boardroom fell silent as I entered the next morning. 14 executives seated around the gleaming conference table, all averting their eyes as I approached. All except Francis Douglas, who rose halfway from his chair, confusion evident on his weathered face. "Alicia, I didn't expect," he began. "I invited her," Carl interrupted smoothly, adjusting his red power tie. "For the announcement portion." Heather sat beside him, elegant in a navy dress I recognized from the company catalog I'd helped develop last spring. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd positioned herself exactly where I used to sit during quarterly meetings, notebook open, pen poised. "Good morning, everyone," I said, my voice steady despite the thundering in my chest. I took the empty seat at the far end of the table, directly opposite Carl. Carl cleared his throat. "Before we get to the quarterly financials, I have 2 announcements to make." His eyes briefly met mine. A flicker of what might have been regret, quickly replaced by resolve. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As some of you may have heard, Alicia has decided to leave Westlake to pursue other opportunities. Several board members shifted uncomfortably. Francis frowned, glancing between Carl and me. The Community Relations Department will be restructured under marketing, effective immediately, Carl continued. Genevieve from marketing will absorb those responsibilities. Genevieve, a talented younger executive I'd mentored, looked down at her hands, clearly uncomfortable with how she'd received the promotion. And on a personal note, Carl's voice softened as he turned to Heather, taking her hand. I'm pleased to announce that Heather and I have decided to marry. A collective intake of breath filled the room. Francis's mouth dropped open. Ian Williams, our CFO, suddenly became fascinated with his coffee cup. Odette from legal studied her tablet with unusual intensity. No one congratulated them. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. I understand this comes as a surprise, Carl said, his corporate smile firmly in place. Alicia and I have been separated for some time, though we kept it private. Another lie. We'd slept in the same bed just 3 nights ago. We wanted to be transparent with the board before rumors began circulating, Heather added, her voice professionally modulated. We believe in Westlake's future and want to ensure a smooth transition. Francis cleared his throat. Carl, perhaps this personal announcement should have been handled differently. Actually, I interrupted calmly, opening my portfolio. Before we move on, I need to address the board on a matter of corporate governance. Carl's smile faltered. We have a full agenda today, Alicia. Perhaps this can wait. It cannot, I said firmly. Francis, as chairman, I'm formally requesting the floor. Francis hesitated, glancing at Carl, then nodded. The floor is yours, Alicia. I stood, distributing folders I'd prepared with Sheila the previous evening. What I'm about to share will impact today's agenda considerably. I apologize for the disruption, but recent events have forced my hand. Carl leaned forward, his knuckles whitening against the polished table. What is this? The truth, I replied simply. I activated the presentation Sheila had prepared. The first slide showed the original incorporation documents of Morris Medical Research, dated February 1998. 25 years ago, Morris Medical Research was founded with an initial investment of $380,000, I began. That investment came from my inheritance, every penny my grandmother left me. Murmurs rippled through the room. Carl's face darkened. For reasons that seemed valid at the time, we agreed to minimize my role on paper. Carl would be the face of the company, while I remained a silent partner with contractual protections. I advanced to the next slide, showing a complex ownership structure. When Kenneth Westlake came on board in 2001, and we rebranded as Westlake Pharmaceuticals, my ownership was further obscured but legally protected through a series of agreements drafted by Sheila Thompson. Carl shot to his feet. This is ancient history and irrelevant to today's meeting. On the contrary, I continued steadily, it's directly relevant to yesterday's events. I turned to face the board members directly. Yesterday afternoon, I was terminated from my position without cause. Francis looked sharply at Carl. You said she resigned. A misunderstanding, Carl said quickly. The restructuring was used as pretext for my termination, I finished, which triggered a specific clause in our founding agreement. I advanced to the slide Sheila had titled Contingency Conversion. The legal language was highlighted in bold. Upon termination without cause of Alicia Dawson Morris, all Class B shares convert to Class A voting shares at a ratio of 3:1, effective immediately. The room went completely still. In practical terms, I continued, my voice the only sound in the stunned silence, as of yesterday at 2:17 p.m. when I signed termination papers, my ownership stake increased from 22% to 66% of voting shares. Ian Williams, always quick with numbers, gasped. That's controlling interest. Carl's face had lost all color. This can't be legal. These agreements were superseded years ago. I nodded to Odette, who was already flipping through the documents I'd provided. As head of legal, she'd been kept in the dark about these original agreements. The language is clear, she said slowly, professional even in her shock. And there's a notarized addendum signed during each restructuring preserving these terms. She looked up at Carl. Did you know about this? Carl's silence was answer enough. Kenneth knew, I said quietly. He helped ensure these protections remained in place through every corporate evolution. He left me a letter before he died warning me that Carl was planning to dilute my ownership through a series of maneuvers that would have worked had I remained employed by the company. Heather was frantically scrolling through her tablet, likely searching for legal loopholes. As majority shareholder, I continued, my first action is to call for a vote of no confidence in the current CEO, effective immediately. Carl slammed, his hand on the table. This is absurd. You can't just walk in and— I can, I interrupted calmly. And I have. Francis, as chairman, would you please call the vote? Francis looked between us, 30 years of friendship with Carl, warring with his duty to the company. I need to consult with legal first. Of course, I nodded. But while we're waiting, I think it's important that the board understand something. I'm not doing this out of vengeance. I looked directly at Carl for the first time. I'm doing this because the same ethical flexibility that led you to betray your wife has been applied to company decisions. And that puts everything we've built at risk. The boardroom erupted into controlled chaos. Odette huddled with Francis and 2 other board members, examining the legal documents. Ian was furiously calculating numbers on his tablet. Heather had pulled Carl into the corner, their urgent whispers, just audible enough to hear her panicked. Fix this. I sat calmly, watching the storm I'd unleashed. My phone buzzed with a text from Sheila. On my way, stall if needed. As I waited, the tension in the room seemed to fade around me, replaced by memories flooding back. The Carl standing before me now, rigid with anger, eyes cold with calculation, was unrecognizable from the man I'd fallen in love with decades ago. My mind drifted back to spring 1997. I was 26 years old, reviewing medication protocols in my small office at University Medical Center, when a tall, lanky man with earnest eyes and unruly brown hair knocked on my doorframe. Excuse me, he said, lab coat slightly rumpled. I'm Dr. Carl Morris from research. I need to discuss the tracking system for the clinical trial medications. That first meeting lasted 2 hours, extending well past my lunch break. Carl's passion for his research, an experimental treatment for autoimmune disorders, was infectious. He explained complex biochemical processes with such clarity and enthusiasm that I found myself completely engrossed. The problem, he confided, leaning across my desk, is funding. The university's grant is minimal, and pharmaceutical companies want proven results before they'll invest. Catch-22, I nodded. You need money to get results, but you need results to get money. His smile transformed his serious face. Exactly. Someone who understands. We began meeting regularly, officially to coordinate trial medications, unofficially because we simply enjoyed each other's company. 3 months later, we were dating. 6 months after that, Carl received the devastating news that his research funding was being cut entirely. What happened? I asked, seeing his expression. He handed me the letter wordlessly. The university was cutting his funding entirely. They're redirecting resources to more promising projects, he said bitterly. That night in my apartment, we sat surrounded by his research notes and proposals rejected by 7 different pharmaceutical companies. The coffee table disappeared beneath stacks of papers representing years of his work. This treatment could help thousands of people, I said, reviewing his meticulous data. These companies are being short-sighted. Carl ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd come to recognize as frustration. Without institutional backing, no one will take the risk. Years of research wasted. I watched him, brilliant, dedicated, but defeated in that moment, and thought about my own recent loss. My grandmother had passed away just 2 months earlier, leaving me her life savings. The money sat untouched in my bank account while I contemplated my future. I'd considered buying a house, investing conservatively, perhaps funding further education. What if we did it ourselves? The words left my mouth before I'd fully formed the thought. Carl looked up, confusion crossing his features. Did what? Start a research company, develop the treatment independently. He laughed, then stopped when he saw my expression. Alicia, that would take hundreds of thousands of dollars. $380,000 to be exact, I said quietly. My inheritance from my grandmother. The memory of his face in that moment, shock transforming into disbelief, then cautious hope, remained one of my most treasured. That night, on my second-hand sofa, our hands intertwined, we dreamed about what would become Morris Medical Research. We'll be partners, I said, excitement building as we sketched plans on the back of a pizza delivery menu. Your research, my funding, and pharmaceutical expertise. Carl grew serious, taking my hands in his. I can't let you risk everything. I believe in you, I said simply. I believe in this treatment, and I believe in us. We'll be partners, I said, excitement building as we sketched plans on the back of a pizza delivery menu. Your research, my funding, and pharmaceutical expertise. Carl grew serious, taking my hands in his. I can't let you risk everything. I believe in you, I said simply. I believe in this treatment, and I believe in us. 2 weeks later, he proposed on the rooftop of the hospital where we'd met. 2 months after that, we were married in a small ceremony with my parents and his mother in attendance. And by fall, we had incorporated Morris Medical Research, with Carl as the public face and primary researcher, and me as the silent partner and administrator. The first years were lean and challenging. We worked out of a converted warehouse space with minimal equipment. Carl conducted his research while I managed the business side, setting up accounting systems, navigating regulatory requirements, and stretching my inheritance to cover each month's expenses. Our breakthrough came in our 3rd year. Carl's late nights had finally yielded promising results, enough to attract attention in the industry. When Kenneth Westlake, a respected pharmaceutical executive nearing retirement, expressed interest in our research, it felt like divine intervention. He brought industry connections, additional funding, and invaluable mentorship. On a warm evening in 2000, Kenneth invited us to his country club, a place so exclusive I'd felt uncomfortable despite wearing my best dress. Over dinner, he studied us with shrewd eyes. You've got something special here, Kenneth told us, swirling his wine thoughtfully. But you need to think about structure and optics. Later that evening, in Kenneth's wood-paneled home office, he raised concerns that would alter the course of our lives. The pharmaceutical industry is still an old boys' club, he said bluntly, swirling brandy in a crystal glass. They'll take a male researcher more seriously, especially with this kind of breakthrough treatment. That's archaic, I protested. It is, Kenneth agreed. But it's reality. If you want this treatment to reach patients, which should be the ultimate goal, you need to play the game. The game, as Kenneth outlined it, involved restructuring the company with Carl as the clear head and me in a supporting role. On paper, my ownership would be reduced, though Kenneth insisted on legal protections written into the bylaws. Never give up control entirely, he advised me privately when Carl stepped out to take a phone call. Men in this industry can get ambitious, even good men like Carl. I remember laughing, dismissing his concern. Carl and I are partners in everything. The paperwork is just for show. Kenneth's expression had remained serious. Humor an old man who's seen too many partnerships dissolve when money and recognition enter the picture. Let my lawyer draft protection clauses, just in case. I'd agreed, more to ease his mind than from any real concern. The clauses he insisted on, including the critical one converting my shares upon wrongful termination, seemed like unnecessary precautions for a marriage and business partnership as solid as ours. How wrong I had been. How naively trusting. The memory of Kenneth's warning resonated through the years, his voice clear in my mind. Never give up control entirely. Even good men like Carl can change when money and recognition enter the picture. How prophetic those words had proven to be. The idealistic scientist I'd fallen in love with had gradually transformed into someone I barely recognized. Ambitious, calculating, willing to betray not just his wife, but the very principles that had once defined him. Alicia? Francis's voice pulled me back to the present. The boardroom had settled somewhat, executives returning to their seats with expressions ranging from shock to calculation. I blinked, the bright lights of the modern boardroom replacing the warm glow of Kenneth's study in my mind. Legal has confirmed the validity of these documents, Francis said, his tone carefully neutral. Your conversion of shares appears to be legitimate. Carl stood ramrod straight at the head of the table, his face a mask of controlled anger. This is a technicality that can be addressed. The termination was part of a larger restructuring, not without cause. Odette shook her head slightly. The termination paperwork specifically cites position elimination as the reason, with no performance issues noted. That constitutes without cause, under any reasonable legal standard. There are 25 years of decisions and agreements to review, Carl insisted. This will take weeks to sort out properly. Actually, I said, checking my watch, Sheila Thompson will be joining us momentarily to address any further legal questions. As the attorney who drafted the original agreements and all subsequent amendments, she can clarify anything that remains unclear. At the mention of Sheila's name, Carl paled visibly. He knew as well as I did that Sheila's meticulous documentation would leave no room for maneuvering. Heather leaned over to whisper something in Carl's ear. He shook his head sharply, then addressed the board. I suggest we adjourn to consider these developments and reconvene when cooler heads prevail. I'm afraid that won't be possible, I replied calmly. Not when there are pressing matters that affect the company's future. Perhaps now would be a good time to discuss Project Artemis? The room went utterly still at the mention of the company's most secretive initiative. Carl's expression confirmed what Kenneth's final letter had warned me about. Something was very wrong with Westlake's flagship project, and only those in the innermost circle knew the truth. Actually, I said, checking my watch, Sheila Thompson will be joining us momentarily to address any further legal questions. As the attorney who drafted the original agreements and all subsequent amendments, she can clarify anything that remains unclear. At the mention of Sheila's name, Carl paled visibly. He knew as well as I did that Sheila's meticulous documentation would leave no room for maneuvering. Heather leaned over to whisper something in Carl's ear. He shook his head sharply, then addressed the board. I suggest we adjourn to consider these developments and reconvene when cooler heads prevail. I'm afraid that won't be possible, I replied calmly. Not when there are pressing matters that affect the company's future. Perhaps now would be a good time to discuss Project Artemis. The room went utterly still at the mention of the company's most secretive initiative. Carl's expression confirmed what Kenneth's final letter had warned me about. Something was very wrong with Westlake's flagship project, and only those in the innermost circle knew the truth. My discovery of Carl's betrayal hadn't happened all at once. Like many painful revelations, it came in pieces, fragments of truth I initially refused to connect. It was exactly 2 months ago when I first noticed something was different. Carl had been working late frequently, citing the importance of Project Artemis, the new immunotherapy drug that promised to revolutionize treatment for several autoimmune conditions. The FDA fast-track application was pending, and everyone at Westlake was focused on making sure nothing went wrong. That Thursday evening, I'd stopped by his office to bring him dinner, a ritual from our early days that had become increasingly rare. The executive floor was quiet, most employees having left hours earlier. Carl's assistant's desk was empty, computer shut down for the night. As I approached Carl's office, I heard laughter, his and a woman's, floating through the partially open door. I paused, not wanting to interrupt if he was in a meeting. They'll never know the difference. Heather's voice, unmistakable with its slight southern lilt. The modified data looks completely natural. Besides, the side effects are minimal. Minimal, but reportable, Carl replied, his tone serious despite his earlier laughter. If the FDA sees the original trial results, they'll delay approval by years. Which is why the original results no longer exist, Heather said confidently. Just the adjusted ones. I froze, the takeout bag suddenly heavy in my hand. Data modification? Hiding side effects from the FDA? This was more than unethical. It was potentially criminal. What about biometrics? They have access to the raw data, Carl asked. Already handled, Heather replied. Ian's team is working with the sanitized version I provided. Only you and I have seen the complete picture. The takeout bag slipped from my fingers, landing with a soft thud on the carpeted hallway. I quickly retrieved it, heart pounding, and retreated silently around the corner. I needed to think, to process what I'd heard without confrontation. If Carl and Heather were falsifying data for the FDA submission, people could be harmed, and Westlake would face devastating consequences when the truth eventually emerged. I left the building without delivering the food, sending Carl a text that I'd been called away to help a friend with an emergency. That night, I barely slept, torn between loyalty to my husband and the company we'd built, and the ethical breach I couldn't ignore. The next day, I began paying closer attention. I noticed how Heather lingered in Carl's office, doors closed for hours at a time. How Carl's demeanor changed when she entered a room. The subtle touches, the private jokes, the shared glances, all the signs I'd been too trusting or too busy to recognize. But more disturbing than the hints of a personal betrayal were the whispers about Project Artemis. Multiple departments seemed to be working with different data sets. Questions from the regulatory team were being intercepted by Heather rather than routed directly to the researchers. A week after overhearing their conversation, I worked late, waiting until Carl texted that he was meeting with investors for dinner. I used my emergency access code, rarely needed in my role but maintained since the company's founding, to enter his office. I wasn't proud of searching my husband's workspace, but the stakes were too high to ignore my suspicions. On his computer, I found nothing unusual. Carl was too careful for that. But in his credenza, locked but accessible with the master key, I still possessed from my days managing office operations, I found a flash drive labeled simply A Original. Hands trembling, I copied the contents to my personal drive before returning it exactly as I'd found it. Later that night, reviewing the files in my home office while Carl attended yet another late meeting, my worst fears were confirmed. The original trial data for Artemis showed concerning liver toxicity in 8% of participants, not life-threatening, but significant enough to require special monitoring and clear warnings. The revised data, which I'd seen in official reports, showed less than 1% incidence, statistically indistinguishable from the placebo group. The falsification was clever, subtle enough that only someone specifically looking for discrepancies would notice, but it was unquestionably deliberate and dangerous. My personal discovery came 2 days later. After downloading the Artemis files, I'd grown more suspicious about every aspect of Carl's behavior. I checked his calendar, noting frequent gaps with no appointments listed. I reviewed his expenses, finding dinners and hotel charges with no corresponding business meetings. Then came the text message, not meant for me at all. I was driving us to a charity gala, Carl in the passenger seat checking emails on his phone, when a message notification appeared. Miss you already. Last night was amazing. Can't wait for Paris next month. Love. Carl quickly dismissed the notification, but not before I glimpsed it from the corner of my eye. He made a show of responding to work emails for the remainder of the drive, but the damage was done. That night, after Carl had fallen asleep, I checked his phone, something I'd never done in 25 years of marriage. The message from Heather was gone, deleted along with their entire conversation history, but his travel itinerary remained, showing a solo research conference in Paris the following month. The next morning, I scheduled lunch with Sheila Thompson, our longtime attorney and the woman who had drafted those crucial protection clauses at Kenneth's insistence all those years ago. I hadn't seen her socially in nearly a year, since Kenneth's funeral. "You seem troubled," Sheila observed after we'd ordered, her shrewd eyes missing nothing. "I need to understand something," I said carefully. "Hypothetically, if someone at Westlake were falsifying data for FDA submissions, what would the implications be?" Sheila's eyebrows rose, but her voice remained measured. "Hypothetically? Criminal charges, massive fines, potentially the end of the company. Definitely the end of any careers involved." She studied me intently. "Alicia, what's going on?" I hadn't intended to tell her everything, but once I started, the words poured out. The overheard conversation, the data discrepancies, and yes, the personal betrayal as well. Sheila listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly grave. When I finished, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "First, we need to protect you," she said firmly. "Then we address the company issues. Kenneth would be heartbroken to see what's happening, but grateful he insisted on those. Protection clauses." She opened her briefcase and withdrew a folder. "I've been meaning to give you this. Kenneth left it with instructions to deliver it if I ever sense trouble at Westlake. I think now qualifies." The folder contained Kenneth's final letter to me, detailing his suspicions about Carl's ethical compromises and his fears for the company's future. It also contained documentation of the shareholding protection clauses and how they would be triggered. "Kenneth saw something in Carl changing," Sheila explained quietly. "He loved you both, but he was worried about the direction Carl was taking after the Neuralex acquisition." As I read Kenneth's words, his elegant handwriting slightly shaky from his illness, the full scope of both betrayals became clear. Husband had not only been unfaithful personally, but had compromised everything we'd built professionally. "What do I do?" I asked, feeling oddly calm despite the devastating revelations. Sheila's answer was simple. "Wait. Document everything. And be ready when they make their move." I didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, Carl informed me that he and the board had decided to eliminate my position. Downsizing, he called it. Restructuring. A business decision, nothing personal. I'd signed the papers without argument, just as Kenneth had predicted I would need to do. The trap had been set decades ago, and Carl had walked right into it. The boardroom remained silent after my mention of Project Artemis. Francis exchanged glances with Odette, while Ian shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Carl's jaw clenched visibly. "Project Artemis is not relevant to this discussion," Carl finally said, his voice tight. "We're discussing ownership shares, not research protocols." "They're inseparable," I replied calmly. "The company's future depends on both its leadership and its flagship product being above reproach." Francis leaned forward. "Alicia, what exactly are you implying about Project Artemis?" Before I could answer, the boardroom door opened, and Sheila Thompson entered, elegant in a charcoal suit, silver hair swept into a sleek bun. Behind her came Dr. Olivia Winters, Westlake's former head of clinical research, who had abruptly retired 6 months earlier. "Sorry I'm late," Sheila announced, setting her briefcase on the table. "Traffic was worse than expected. I see you've begun without me." Carl's face darkened. This meeting is for board members and current executives only. Dr. Winters is no longer affiliated with Westlake. Actually, I interjected, as majority shareholder, I've invited them both to provide context that will help the board understand how we arrived at this moment. The path that had led us here stretched back far beyond my personal discovery of Carl's betrayal. To truly understand what was happening at Westlake Pharmaceuticals, the board needed to know its complete history, including the parts that had been carefully hidden from them. Dr. Winters, I said, nodding to the distinguished researcher, would you please share with the board why you left Westlake 6 months ago? Olivia stepped forward, her posture straight despite the tension visible in her shoulders. At 65, she had been one of the most respected researchers in immunology, her presence lending credibility to Westlake's scientific endeavors. I was asked to approve modified clinical data for the Artemis FDA submission, she stated firmly. When I refused, I was given the choice to retire with a generous package or be terminated for failure to align with company objectives. Murmurs rippled through the boardroom. Francis looked shocked. That's an outrageous claim, Carl snapped. Dr. Winters had performance issues that were well documented. Her allegations are simply attempts to deflect from her own failings. Are they? Sheila opened her briefcase and distributed folders to each board member. These documents tell a different story. As the board members examined the evidence, I reflected on how we had reached this critical juncture. The company's evolution had been marked by key moments that, in retrospect, revealed the gradual shift in Carl's priorities and ethics. Westlake Pharmaceuticals hadn't always been the industry leader it was today. After our early years as Morris Medical Research, the rebranding and partnership with Kenneth Westlake in 2001 had marked our first major expansion. Kenneth's investment and industry connections had accelerated our growth, allowing us to move from basic research into clinical development. By 2005, we had our first successful drug on the market, NeuroClear, a treatment for nerve pain that had emerged from Carl's original research. The royalties transformed our financial situation, allowing us to expand our research team and facilities. Carl and I had purchased our colonial home that year, celebrating with champagne on the empty living room floor, dreaming of the family we hoped to have. The company continued to grow steadily until 2010, when a promising cancer drug failed in late-stage trials. The setback had nearly devastated us financially and emotionally. I remembered holding Carl as he wept, his years of work proving ineffective despite early promising results. It happens, Kenneth had counseled us over dinner at his home. The best scientists face failure. It's how you respond that defines you. Carl had seemed to take the advice to heart, redoubling his efforts on more promising research areas. But looking back, I could see that something fundamental had shifted. The scientist who had once been driven by helping patients began focusing more on quarterly results and stock valuations. The acquisition of Neurolex Pharmaceuticals in 2015 had been our largest expansion, and in hindsight, a turning point. The smaller company had complementary research in autoimmune disorders, making it an attractive target. But the $120 million purchase price had stretched our resources and increased pressure for returns. It was during the integration of Neurolex that Heather had entered our lives. She had been their head of investor relations, a position that put her in frequent contact with Carl during the transition. I had found her impressive, articulate, knowledgeable, with an energetic presence that enlivened meetings. When Carl's executive assistant retired later that year, I had suggested Heather for the role. She's overqualified, Carl had objected initially. An executive position at Neurolex to an assistant role? It would keep her in the company during the restructuring, I had countered, and you need someone who understands both organizations during the transition. It could be temporary until we find a better fit for her skills. Carl had agreed, and Heather had accepted with apparent gratitude. The temporary arrangement had soon become permanent, with Heather proving herself indispensable to Carl. She anticipated his needs, streamlined his communications, and increasingly represented him in internal meetings he was too busy to attend. Had been pleased at first, grateful that Carl had such competent support during the stressful integration period. I'd even invited Heather to our home for dinner several times, wanting to make her feel welcomed into the Westlake family. Kenneth, however, had been less impressed. "Watch that one," he had murmured to me at the company holiday party in 2016, nodding toward Heather as she laughed at something Carl said. "She's ambitious in ways that aren't always healthy for an organization." I had dismissed his concern as old-fashioned caution. "She's good at her job, Kenneth. Carl trusts her." "That's what worries me," he had replied, his eyes serious despite his smile. Kenneth's health had begun declining the following year. By 2018, he had stepped back from active involvement in company operations, though he maintained his position on the board. His absence had created a vacuum that Carl quickly filled, consolidating his authority as CEO and chairman. The company had continued its upward trajectory. Project Artemis had emerged from our researchers' work in 2020, showing extraordinary promise for treating multiple autoimmune conditions with a single approach. The potential market was enormous, and the FDA had granted fast-track designation based on early results. When Kenneth passed away last year, his final board meeting had included a warning that now seemed prophetic. "Never sacrifice integrity for speed," he had told the assembled executives. "Our responsibility is to patients first, shareholders second." At his funeral, Carl had delivered a moving eulogy about Kenneth's principles and vision. Less than 6 months later, he had begun dismantling those very principles in pursuit of faster approval for Artemis. Now, in the boardroom, the evidence of that betrayal lay before the shocked board members. Sheila's documents included side-by-side comparisons of the original and modified trial data, emails between Carl and Heather discussing how to manage the results, and Dr. Winter's formal objections before her forced retirement. "This is potentially criminal," Odette said finally, looking up from the folder with horror. "If the FDA discovers this manipulation," "which they will," Dr. Winters interjected, "when patients start experiencing the liver toxicity at 3 times the rate reported in our submission." Francis turned to Carl, his expression a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Is this true? Did you authorize these changes to the Artemis data?" Carl's face had gone from flushed to ashen. Beside him, Heather stared straight ahead, her earlier confidence evaporated. "The modifications were within acceptable statistical parameters," Carl said finally. "Every pharmaceutical company makes judgment calls about how to present clinical data." "Not like this," Dr. Winters countered firmly. "This crosses every ethical and legal line in clinical research. I watched my husband, the brilliant scientist I had once invested everything in, attempting to justify actions that violated everything we had once stood for. In that moment, I felt not anger, but profound sadness for how far he had fallen from the idealistic researcher who had once worked tirelessly to help patients. The board needs to understand exactly what's at stake," I said quietly. "These aren't just ethical violations. They threaten the very existence of Westlake Pharmaceuticals and the treatments that help millions of patients." The boardroom fell into stunned silence as the members processed the evidence before them. Francis looked physically ill, while Ian frantically flipped through the financial implications outlined in the final pages of Sheila's report. "If this submission goes forward and the FDA later discovers the falsification," Sheila explained, her tone measured but grave, "Westlake would face fines potentially exceeding $300 million, not to mention criminal charges against those responsible. And a complete loss of credibility with regulatory agencies worldwide," Dr. Winters added. "Future submissions would face extraordinary scrutiny." Carl remained silent, his earlier defiance replaced by grim calculation. Heather whispered urgently, in his ear, but he shook his head slightly in response. "This is distressing information," Francis said finally. But it doesn't explain why you never revealed your ownership stake until now, Alicia. If you knew about these issues, why wait until after your termination to come forward? It was a fair question, one that deserved a complete answer. The truth was that my value to Westlake had always been more complex and substantial than anyone realized. I had remained in the shadows by choice, but that time had ended. My role at Westlake has always been deliberately understated, I began. Most of you know me as the Director of Community Relations, overseeing charitable initiatives and public engagement. But that position was merely my official capacity. I opened my laptop and connected it to the room's projection system. The screen displayed a simple organizational chart showing positions rather than names. Since our founding, I've served as an internal check and balance, someone who could observe operations from multiple levels without the filters typically placed around executives. I highlighted several positions on the chart. I've had direct access to departments across the organization, from research to regulatory to manufacturing. Ian nodded slowly. You've always had unusual visibility across divisions. I assumed it was because of your marriage to Carl. Partially, I acknowledged. But it was also by Kenneth's design. He believed pharmaceutical companies needed ethical guardians who could see the full picture without departmental biases. I advanced to the next slide, showing a timeline of major company decisions dating back 15 years. In 2008, I identified manufacturing inconsistencies in our Montreal facility before they triggered a recall, I explained, pointing to the first entry. In 2011, I restructured our patient assistance program, simultaneously improving access and saving $4.2 million annually. In 2014, I developed our relationship with the Indonesian Health Ministry, opening a market that now generates $48 million in annual revenue. Francis leaned forward, studying the timeline with newfound interest. I remember these initiatives, but they were always presented as team efforts or executive committee decisions. Because that served the company's interests, I replied. My effectiveness depended partly on being underestimated, on being seen as simply Carl's wife with a ceremonial role. Carl shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He knew better than anyone how strategic my contributions had been, even as he minimized them to others. When the Neurolex acquisition was being negotiated, I continued, I identified the patent vulnerability in their secondary portfolio that allowed us to reduce the purchase price by $18 million. Carl presented the finding to the board, but the research was mine. Several board members exchanged glances. They'd praised Carl extensively for that particular insight. Most recently, I established our partnership with Meridian Research Network, giving us access to their patient data platform for clinical trials. I highlighted the entry from just 8 months ago. That partnership reduced our recruitment costs by 30% and accelerated our timeline across 5 development programs. Odette nodded. I wondered how that deal came together so quickly. Meridian had previously refused partnerships with 3 other pharmaceutical companies. Their CEO's daughter benefited from our patient assistance program for NeuroClear, I explained. The relationship I built through that experience opened doors that would have remained closed to traditional business approaches. I closed the laptop, turning to face the board directly. My value to Westlake has never been limited to community relations. I've been integral to operations, strategy, and relationships since our founding. Carl knows this better than anyone. Alt-I. Eyes turned to Carl, who had the decency to look momentarily abashed before his expression hardened again. Alicia has contributed in various ways over the years, he acknowledged stiffly, but her position was legitimately eliminated in our restructuring plan. The timing may seem convenient, but the decision was based on business needs. Was it? Sheila asked, raising an eyebrow. She displayed a slide showing the internal memo authorizing my termination, dated just 2 days after I had met with Dr. Winters to discuss my concerns about the Artemis data. This timeline suggests the restructuring was hastily planned after Alicia began asking questions about Project Artemis, Sheila observed. not as part of a long-term organizational strategy. Heather finally spoke up, her voice tightly controlled. These insinuations are inappropriate. Carl made difficult business decisions for the good of the company, including your promotion to Vice President of Strategic Initiatives, I asked quietly. A position created the same day mine was eliminated? Spots of color appeared on Heather's cheeks. I earned that promotion through years of dedication. No one is questioning your work ethic, Heather, I replied evenly. But the timing and circumstances merit examination. I turned back to the board members, whose expressions ranged from confusion to growing comprehension. They were beginning to understand the full picture, not just of Carl's personal betrayal, but of his systematic effort to remove anyone who might interfere with his plans for Artemis. What many of you don't know is that I've maintained relationships with the researchers who actually developed Artemis, I continued. While Carl managed the executive aspects, I stayed connected to the scientists doing the work. I nodded to Dr. Winters, who opened her own laptop and brought up a different set of data. For the past 3 months, I've been working with Dr. Winters and her former team on an alternative approach to address the liver toxicity issues in Artemis, I explained. Rather than hiding the problem, we've been solving it. Dr. Winters took over, her scientific expertise evident as she walked the board through the modified formulation her team had developed. By adjusting the delivery mechanism and dosing protocol, we've reduced toxicity to clinically insignificant levels while maintaining efficacy, she explained, pointing to comparative charts. These results are preliminary but promising enough that we could approach the FDA with a transparent amendment to our application. The solution was elegant and completely different from Carl's approach of concealment. This alternative would delay approval by approximately 6 months, Dr. Winters concluded, but it would result in a safer, more effective product with no regulatory risks. Francis turned to Carl. Why wasn't this approach pursued originally? Carl's jaw tightened. The delay would have pushed approval into next fiscal year, affecting our financial projections and stock performance. And your performance bonuses, Ian added quietly, the financial implications becoming clear to the CFO. You risked patient safety, company reputation, and potentially the entire future of Westlake for a faster approval timeline, Francis asked, disbelief evident in his voice. I made decisions under tremendous pressure to deliver results, Carl responded defensively. The entire pharmaceutical industry operates under these constraints. Not like this, Francis replied firmly. Not at Westlake, not under Kenneth's principles. I watched the board members' expressions shift as they processed everything they'd learned. My hidden value to the company had always extended far beyond my official title. I had been its ethical compass, its relationship builder, its problem solver. Carl had known this when he married me, appreciated it for years, then deliberately pushed me aside when my integrity became inconvenient. My termination wasn't just a personal betrayal, I said quietly. It was a strategic removal of the person most likely to expose the Artemis data issues before they reached the FDA. What Carl hadn't anticipated was that Kenneth's foresight and my preparation had transformed his action from a power move into a catastrophic miscalculation, one that had now exposed everything he had tried to hide. As the gravity of the situation settled over the boardroom, Carl appeared to recalculate his position. His initial shock had given way to a more measured demeanor, the negotiator emerging from the defeated executive. These are serious allegations that deserve proper investigation, he said, his voice regaining some confidence. But right now, we're in the middle of a critical FDA submission. Any disruption could destroy years of work and hundreds of millions in investment. He turned to face the board members directly. I propose we table this discussion, continue with the current Artemis timeline, and form a committee to investigate these claims thoroughly. After approval, we can submit amendments if necessary. It was a calculated appeal to financial interests, prioritizing short-term approval over ethical concerns. I watched several board members consider his proposal, their expressions revealing. the internal conflict between corporate responsibility and shareholder value. This was precisely the moment I had prepared for in the weeks since discovering Carl's betrayal. My response had not been emotional or impulsive, but carefully orchestrated to address exactly this scenario. That approach would compound the legal exposure rather than mitigate it, I said calmly. Fortunately, I've developed an alternative strategy. I nodded to Sheila, who distributed another set of documents to the board members. What you're receiving is a comprehensive transition plan, I explained. It includes 3 key components. First, a voluntary disclosure to the FDA regarding the Artemis data issues. Second, submission of Dr. Winter's modified formulation as an amendment to the current application. And third, a leadership restructuring to ensure proper oversight moving forward. The board members flipped through the detailed proposal. 38 pages of precisely outlined steps, timelines, and contingencies. You prepared all this since yesterday? Francis asked, clearly impressed by the thoroughness. No, I admitted. I've been developing this plan for 6 weeks, ever since I confirmed the data manipulation. My termination was actually the trigger. I needed to implement it. Carl looked stunned. You planned for your own firing? For the first time that morning, I allowed myself a small smile. I anticipated it. There's a difference. In truth, the preparation had begun the very night I overheard Carl and Heather discussing the modified data. Instead of confronting them immediately, which would have allowed time for evidence to disappear, I had methodically built my case and prepared for multiple scenarios. First, I had secured the original Artemis data, creating multiple encrypted backups stored in locations Carl couldn't access. Then I had reached out to Dr. Winters, arranging our first discreet meeting at a coffee shop 20 miles from Westlake's headquarters. I need to understand what really happened with your departure, I had told her, careful to speak quietly despite the bustling cafe around us. The relief on her face had been palpable as she realized someone finally wanted the truth. I've been waiting for someone to ask, she'd replied, pulling out a notebook filled with meticulous documentation of the changes she'd been asked to approve. Over the following weeks, we had assembled a small, trusted team of researchers who had worked on Artemis from the beginning. Meeting in evenings and on weekends, away from Westlake's offices, they had developed and tested the modified formulation that addressed the liver toxicity issues. Simultaneously, I had consulted with Sheila about the legal implications of both, the data falsification and my ownership stake. Together, we had crafted a strategy that would protect the company while ensuring accountability. Your plan assumes you have the authority to implement it, Carl pointed out, studying the document. With growing concern, the board would need to approve such drastic changes. As majority shareholder, I can call for votes on each element, I replied. But I'd prefer the board recognize the wisdom of this approach and support it voluntarily. I turned to Francis. The plan protects Westlake's long-term interests. Yes, it will impact this quarter's projections and likely our stock price in the short term. But it preserves the company's reputation, prevents regulatory penalties, and most importantly, ensures patient safety. Francis studied the proposal thoughtfully. The voluntary disclosure approach is risky. The FDA could still impose penalties. They could, Sheila acknowledged. But our legal analysis suggests they would be substantially reduced compared to penalties imposed after the agency discovers the issues independently. The good faith disclosure creates a significant mitigating factor. And the leadership restructuring? Odette asked, eyeing the section that addressed executive changes. This is quite extensive. It addresses not just the immediate issues, but the cultural factors that allowed them to develop, I explained. A comprehensive approach is necessary to prevent similar problems in the future. The restructuring plan called for Carl's removal as CEO, the formation of an ethics oversight committee with direct board reporting lines, and a thorough review of all executive decisions made during the past 18 months. Ian, ever focused on financial implications, raised the most pressing concern. What about the shareholders? This will trigger a significant sell-off when it becomes public. That's addressed on page 24, I replied. We've developed a communication strategy that emphasizes the long-term benefits of transparency and our proactive approach to addressing the issues. Additionally, I'm prepared to use my personal resources to establish a stock stabilization fund if necessary. My willingness to back the plan financially seemed to surprise several board members. It underscored that my commitment wasn't just to my own interests, but to the company's survival and ethical restoration. Throughout the discussion, Heather had grown increasingly agitated, whispering urgently to Carl and typing frantically on her tablet. Finally, she interrupted. "This is absurd," she said sharply. "Carl has led this company to record profits for 5 consecutive quarters. This entire presentation is nothing but a vindictive response to personal issues." Her characterization hung in the air for a moment before I responded. "Personal issues didn't falsify clinical data," I said quietly. "Personal issues didn't force out researchers who raised concerns. And personal issues didn't jeopardize patient safety for the sake of faster approval timelines." I stood, addressing the board directly. "I understand this is overwhelming. You're being asked to choose between continuing a comfortable but dangerous path or taking a difficult but principled stand." I paused, looking each member in the eye. Kenneth Westlake built this company on the belief that doing right by patients would ultimately do right by shareholders. I'm asking you to honor that legacy. Francis looked down at the proposal again, then at Carl, his expression troubled. 25 years of friendship warred with his responsibility as chairman. "Carl," he said finally, "would you and Heather step out for a few minutes? The board needs to discuss this privately." Carl rose slowly, his expression unreadable. "Before you make any decisions, remember that I've devoted my life to this company. Everything I've done has been to ensure its success, including firing your wife and manipulating clinical data?" Francis asked quietly. Carl had no answer for that. He and Heather left the room in silence, the door closing firmly behind them. Once they were gone, Francis turned to me. "You could have revealed all this the moment you discovered it. Why wait until now? Why let yourself be terminated first?" The question cut to the heart of my strategy. Why I had allowed events to unfold as they had instead of confronting Carl immediately. Because exposing the issues without having solutions in place would have damaged Westlake beyond repair, I answered honestly. I needed time to secure the evidence, develop the alternative formulation, and prepare the transition plan. And most importantly, I needed Carl to take an action that would trigger the share conversion clause, giving me the authority to implement these changes. It had been a calculated risk, letting Carl believe he was removing an obstacle while actually giving me the very power I needed to save the company from his compromised leadership. "You sacrificed yourself to save Westlake," Odette said with newfound respect. "Not sacrificed," I corrected her. "Strategically positioned. There's a difference." As the board began their private deliberations, I stepped out into the hallway with Sheila and Dr. Winters. The executive floor was eerily quiet. Word of the emergency meeting had spread, and most employees were keeping their distance, unsure of what was unfolding in the boardroom. Carl and Heather were nowhere to be seen, likely retreated to his office to develop their counter-strategy. For the moment, we had a brief respite to gather our thoughts. "You did well in there," Sheila said, squeezing my arm gently. "They're listening." Dr. Winters nodded in agreement. Francis's face when he saw the original data, I don't think he had any idea how severe the manipulation was. I leaned against the wall, suddenly feeling the weight of the past 6 weeks. The strain of maintaining appearances while gathering evidence, the sleepless nights developing the transition plan, the emotional toll of watching my marriage crumble while fighting to save the company we'd built, it all crashed over me at once. "I couldn't have done this alone," I said quietly. "Not any of it." And it was true. While Carl had been systematically isolating me professionally, I had been building a network of allies who shared my concerns about Westlake's direction. People whose loyalty was to the company's mission rather than to Carl personally. Dr. Winters had been the first, providing crucial scientific expertise and access to the researchers who had developed Artemis. Sheila had been my legal lifeline, helping navigate the complex implications of Carl's actions and my ownership stake. But there were others who had formed my support system during this crisis. My thoughts turned to Genevieve from marketing, who had come to my office 3 months ago, visibly distressed after being instructed to prepare materials that overstated Artemis's benefits while minimizing potential side effects. "I don't feel right about this, Alicia," she had confided. "But I was told the directives came straight from Carl, and questioning them would be unwise." Instead of dismissing her concerns, I had listened carefully, asking her to document the specific requests and forward them to me for coordination purposes. Those documents now formed part of the evidence showing the systematic nature of the deception. Then there was Marcus from Regulatory Affairs, a veteran employee who had been with Westlake since the early days. He had approached me at the company picnic last month, carefully steering me away from the crowd. "There are inconsistencies in the Artemis submission package," he had said in a low voice. "Data that doesn't match what I saw in preliminary reports." When I raised questions, Heather intervened and said she would handle all Artemis-related communications personally. His testimony, recorded discreetly in Sheila's office, provided crucial context about how normal oversight channels had been circumvented. Even Ian, though officially part of the executive team, had subtly aided my efforts. After our quarterly budget review meeting, he had lingered behind, closing the door before speaking. "The financial projections for Artemis seem optimistic," he had observed carefully, "and the contingency reserves for potential adverse events have been reduced below our standard protocols." His willingness to highlight these discrepancies, however obliquely, had helped me track the paper trail of decisions leading to the current crisis. "Alicia?" Sheila's voice pulled me back to the present. "Are you all right?" I nodded, straightening my posture. "Just thinking about everyone who helped us get here. Their courage made this possible." "Kenneth would be proud," Dr. Winters said softly. "He always said you were the heart of Westlake, the one who truly understood what the company was meant to be." Kenneth. His absence felt particularly acute today. He had been more than a mentor to me. He had become a second father, guiding my development as a business leader while Carl focused increasingly on external recognition. Our monthly dinners, continued even after his official retirement, had been filled with discussions about pharmaceutical ethics, leadership challenges, and the future of medicine. Kenneth had seen the changes in Carl before I had allowed myself to recognize them. "Power reveals character. It doesn't change it," he had told me during our last dinner together, just weeks before his death. Carl's ambition was always there. "Alicia, it was once tempered by your influence and my oversight. I worry about what happens when those guardrails are gone." At the time, I had defended Carl, attributing Kenneth's concerns to the natural caution of age. Now I recognized the wisdom in his warning, and his foresight in ensuring I would have the legal protections I needed when the moment of crisis arrived. My phone buzzed with a text from Francis. "Board ready for you now." As we turned to re-enter the boardroom, we encountered Carl and Heather coming down the hallway. Carl's expression was grim determination. Heather's barely controlled panic. "The board has requested we all return," I said neutrally. Carl nodded stiffly. "This isn't over. Alicia, you may have planned this ambush well, but there are aspects of the situation you haven't considered." "I've considered more than you realize," I replied quietly, "including what happens after today's decision." For a moment, standing face to face with the man I had loved for 25 years, I felt a flicker of the connection that had once bound us together, brilliant young professionals with shared dreams and values. When had we diverged so completely? At what point had Carl decided that success justified any means necessary to achieve it? The door to the boardroom opened, and Francis beckoned us inside. The moment for reflection had passed. Now we would face whatever decision the board had reached. As we took our seats, I noted that the board members' expressions had shifted. The shock and confusion from earlier had been replaced by a collective resolve. Francis, in particular, seemed to have aged years in the past hour, the weight of his responsibility evident in the deep lines around his eyes. "We've reviewed the evidence and discussed the options thoroughly," he began, his voice steady despite the tension. "This is without question the most difficult situation our board has faced." He turned to Carl. "We've also heard your perspective on the Artemis data and the decisions you made regarding its presentation to the FDA." Carl straightened in his chair. "I maintain that my actions were within acceptable industry parameters and in the company's best interests." Francis shook his head slightly. "The board disagrees. The manipulation of clinical data crosses ethical and legal boundaries that Westlake has always respected, even when competitors did not. It was Kenneth's founding principle that our medications would stand on their genuine merits, not marketing spin or selective data presentation." Heather started to interject, but Francis raised his hand to silence her. "As for the termination of Alicia Morris," he continued, "the board finds that it was executed without proper cause or consultation, apparently motivated by personal conflicts and the desire to remove oversight of the Artemis process." Carl's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. "Therefore," Francis said, his gaze sweeping the room, "the board acknowledges Alicia Morris's conversion of shares to voting status as valid under the terms of the original agreements. As majority shareholder, she has the authority to direct the company's immediate actions regarding both Project Artemis and leadership structure. It was as definitive a victory as I could have hoped for. Validation not just of my legal position, but of my ethical concerns as well. Yet I felt no triumph, only a profound sense of responsibility for what came next. The board further recommends," Francis continued, "that we implement the transition plan Alicia has presented, with certain modifications to timing and public communications that we've outlined here." He slid a document across the table to me. I scanned the annotations quickly, minor adjustments that preserved the core elements while accelerating the FDA disclosure and adding more detailed shareholder communications. The board had not only accepted my plan, but strengthened it. "Thank you," I said, looking up at the assembled board members. "I accept these recommendations and am prepared to begin implementation immediately." Carl's expression had gone completely blank. The practiced neutrality of a man accustomed to concealing his thoughts in high-stakes negotiations. But Heather was less controlled, her fingers gripping the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened. "You can't possibly expect this transition to be successful," she said, her voice sharp with desperation. "Carl built relationships with investors. Researchers, regulators, they trust him, not you." I met her gaze steadily. "Those relationships were built on Westlake's reputation for integrity, a reputation we're now fighting to preserve. And contrary to what you might believe, many of those connections were actually my work, not Carl's. The personal dynamics that had brought us to this point, the affair, the betrayal, the planned engagement announcement, suddenly seemed secondary to the larger issues at stake. This wasn't about my marriage anymore. It was about the future of Westlake Pharmaceuticals and the patients who depended on our treatments. "What happens now?" Carl asked, his voice carefully neutral. Francis answered before I could. "The board will announce your resignation as CEO, effective immediately." "Resignation?" Carl's voice was dangerously quiet. The controlled facade he had maintained throughout the meeting finally cracked, revealing the anger beneath. "After 25 years, you expect me to simply walk away?" "Not empty-handed," Francis clarified. "The severance package is generous considering the circumstances." Odette slid a folder across the table. Carl made no move to take it, his eyes fixed on Francis with an intensity that made several board members shift uncomfortably. "I built this company," he said, each word precise and clipped. From a warehouse laboratory to a global pharmaceutical leader. And you're casting me aside based on one person's accusations? Based on documented evidence, Francis corrected firmly. From multiple sources. Evidence curated by my wife during a divorce dispute, Carl countered, a hint of desperation entering his voice. He turned to the other board members. Can't you see what's happening? This is a personal vendetta disguised as corporate concern. I remained silent, allowing the board to respond. Carl's attempt to reframe the situation as a marital dispute rather than an ethical breach was predictable and ultimately futile given the extensive documentation. The evidence stands on its own merits, Ian stated flatly. The financial implications of the Artemis data manipulation are clearly documented and impossible to ignore. Carl changed tactics, his expression softening as he addressed the board. We've worked together for years. You know my commitment to Westlake. If there were oversights in the Artemis process, they were made in service to the company's growth. Let me correct them. I can personally oversee a revised submission. Several. Board members exchanged glances, and I sensed a momentary wavering. Carl's persuasive abilities had always been formidable. His talent for presenting himself as the indispensable visionary had carried him through previous controversies. Heather seized the opening. The succession plan requires at least 6 months of transition, she noted, flipping through the company bylaws on her tablet. An immediate resignation would destabilize operations and violate our governance structure. It was a clever angle, using Westlake's own protocols as a shield. For a moment, I saw uncertainty flicker across Francis's face, but Sheila was prepared. The bylaws provide an exception in cases of ethical breaches, she countered smoothly. Section 18, Paragraph 4 specifically addresses leadership transitions when integrity issues are involved. Heather's expression tightened. She hadn't anticipated Sheila's encyclopedic knowledge of the governance documents she herself had drafted decades earlier. Carl changed tactics again, turning to address me directly for the first time. Alicia, he said, his tone softening to the one he'd used countless times during our marriage when trying to resolve a disagreement. We built this together. Whatever personal issues have come between us, destroying everything we've created isn't the answer. It was a masterful attempt at emotional manipulation, invoking our shared history to bypass the ethical issues at hand. For a fleeting moment, I felt the pull of 25 years of partnership, remembered the idealistic young scientist who had once valued truth above all else. This isn't about destroying what we built, I replied quietly. It's about preserving it. The Carl I married would never have compromised patient safety for faster approvals or quarterly bonuses. Something flickered in his eyes, perhaps recognition, perhaps regret. But it vanished quickly, replaced by calculation. If you force this, he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear, I'll fight it with everything I have. The disclosure will be public. Our personal issues will be exposed. Your inheritance, our history, all of it will become fodder for financial blogs and industry gossip. It was his final card, the threat of mutually assured destruction. A messy public battle that would damage Westlake regardless of who ultimately prevailed. Before I could respond, the boardroom door burst open. A young woman from the IT department, Sarah, I recalled, entered with a tablet in hand, her expression urgent. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, glancing nervously around the room. But there's something the board needs to see immediately. Francis frowned at the interruption. We're in the middle of a critical meeting. I know, sir, Sarah replied, her voice steadying with resolve. But someone is attempting to delete server files related to Project Artemis. The system flagged it as unusual activity because it's accessing archived data from multiple secure directories simultaneously. All eyes turned to Heather, whose tablet was still open before her. Her fingers froze above the screen, color draining from her face. The deletion commands are coming from an executive access point, Sarah continued, glancing at Heather's tablet. The system log shows the credentials being used belong to... She paused, checking her notes. Heather Miller. The room fell silent. Heather's unauthorized attempt to delete evidence during the board meeting itself was a devastating development. One that transformed any lingering doubts into certainty. Is the data being preserved? Odette asked sharply. Sarah nodded. Our security protocols flag and halt unusual mass deletions. I've locked the relevant directories pending leadership authorization. But I thought the board should know immediately. Thank you, Sarah, Francis said, his expression grim. You did exactly the right thing. As Sarah left, closing the door behind her, Heather looked desperately to Carl. I was just securing sensitive information, she attempted weakly. Standard? Protocol during leadership transitions. By deleting original research data? Dr. Winters asked incredulously. There's no legitimate reason to remove those files. Carl's expression had hardened into something I'd never seen before. Cold fury mixed with the realization that his position had become untenable. His eyes darted around the room, assessing and discarding options with the rapid calculation that had made him so successful in business negotiations. Finally, he stood abruptly. I won't be subjected to this kangaroo court. If the board has made its decision, so be it. But this isn't over. He turned to leave, but Francis's voice stopped him. Carl, your resignation letter. The press release goes out in 1 hour. For a moment, I thought he might refuse. Instead, he returned to the table, scrawled his signature on the document Odette prepared, and pushed it back across the surface, with enough force that it slid off the edge. Without another word, he strode from the room, Heather hurrying after him. As the door closed behind them, the tension in the boardroom visibly eased. Several members exhaled audibly, as if they'd been holding their breath throughout the confrontation. That could have gone worse, Ian observed dryly. It still might, Sheila cautioned. Carl won't surrender control without a fight. The attempted data deletion was likely just the first countermove. She was right. Carl was resourceful, connected, and now cornered. A dangerous combination. His parting words hadn't been empty threats. They'd been a declaration of intent. Francis turned to me, his expression troubled. What do you think he'll do? I considered the question carefully. I had known Carl for 26 years, had loved him, worked alongside him, watched his transformation from idealistic scientist to compromised executive. If anyone could anticipate his next move, it would be me. He'll try to rally support from major shareholders, I said finally. Present himself as the visionary being ousted by bureaucrats who don't understand the realities of the pharmaceutical industry. He has close relationships with several institutional investors who might be persuaded to pressure the board. And Heather? Odette asked. She'll focus on damage control, I replied. Reaching out to contacts in regulatory affairs, attempting to control the narrative about the Artemis data. Her network in the industry isn't as extensive as Carl's, but she's built strategic relationships over the past few years. We need to move quickly then, Francis decided. Implement the transition plan immediately, beginning with the FDA disclosure and the press announcement about leadership changes. As the board began discussing implementation details, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I glanced. Down discreetly. You've won the battle but not the war. Check your home security system. A cold weight settled in my stomach. The threat was clear. Carl was escalating beyond professional retaliation to personal intimidation. The man I had married, the father of the children we had hoped for but never had, was now threatening me directly. I showed the message to Sheila, whose expression darkened. We should contact the police, she murmured. Not yet, I replied quietly. Let's see what he's actually done first. Whatever Carl was planning, I needed to be prepared. The confrontation was moving beyond the boardroom to a more personal battlefield, and the stakes were escalating from professional reputation to potentially my safety. The board meeting continued, focusing now on implementing the transition plan. I tried to concentrate on the discussion, but Carl's threatening text kept pulling my attention away. What had he done to our home? Was it merely an intimidation tactic, or something more concrete? Alicia? Francis's voice broke through my distraction. We were discussing the press release language. Do you have a preference on how your role is described? I refocused on the matter at hand. Let's keep it simple and forward-looking. Alicia Morris, co-founder and majority shareholder, will assume the role of interim CEO while a search committee identifies a permanent successor. Not interested in the permanent position? Ian asked, surprised. My priority is stabilizing Westlake and addressing the Artemis issues, I replied. Long-term leadership decisions can wait until we've navigated the immediate crisis. As the discussion continued, Sheila quietly excused herself, stepping into the hallway with her phone. When she returned a few minutes later, she gave me a subtle nod that suggested she had taken some action regarding Carl's threat, likely contacting security or perhaps the police despite my hesitation. The meeting progressed efficiently, with assignments distributed and a timeline established for the critical next steps. The FDA disclosure would happen immediately, led by Dr. Winters and the original Artemis research team. The shareholder communication would follow within hours, explaining both the leadership change and the proactive approach to the Artemis issues. We wrapped up the formal proceedings. Francis asked everyone except me to leave for a moment. When the room had cleared, he sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. I've known Carl for nearly 3 decades, he said quietly. Played golf with him, vacationed with our families, watched him build this company from nothing. I never imagined he could compromise his principles so completely. Neither did I admitted. The change was gradual, so subtle that I made excuses for each small ethical lapse, until suddenly they weren't small anymore. Francis nodded solemnly. Kenneth saw it happening. About a year before he died, he told me to watch the paperwork. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. He was referring to the protection clauses, I realized. He knew Carl might try to remove me someday. Kenneth was always 10 steps ahead of everyone else, Francis agreed. He hesitated, then added, There's something you should know. When Kenneth first approached me about becoming chairman, he insisted on one condition I never fully understood, until today. He withdrew an envelope from his suit jacket, the paper yellowed with age. He asked me to keep this in my personal safe, to be opened only if there was ever a fundamental conflict between you and Carl over the company's direction. My hands trembled slightly as I accepted the envelope. The seal had already been broken. Francis had obviously read the contents earlier today. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in Kenneth's distinctive handwriting, to the chairman. Of the board, Westlake Pharmaceuticals. If you are reading this, the situation I hoped would never arise has occurred. Carl and Alicia are at odds over the company's fundamental direction or ethics. Carl is brilliant, visionary, and capable of extraordinary achievements. But his ambition has always been his vulnerability. I have watched with concern as his decisions increasingly prioritize growth and recognition over the careful, patient science that built our reputation. Alicia is the company's conscience, its ethical compass. She has been the silent force behind many of our most important initiatives, often without recognition or credit. Her judgment in matters of corporate responsibility has been unfailingly sound. The legal protections I insisted upon for her ownership stake were not mere technicalities, but essential safeguards for the company's soul. If these protections have been activated, it is because they were necessary. My final directive as founder. In any conflict between profit and principle, Westlake must choose principle. The protections built into Alicia's ownership agreement ensure this choice remains possible, regardless of who holds the title of CEO. Trust her judgment. She was my finest investment. Kenneth Westlake tears blurred my vision as I finished reading. Kenneth's faith in me, expressed so clearly in words he'd never shared directly, felt like a posthumous embrace, a validation of the difficult path I'd chosen. He left similar letters with Sheila and the company archivist, Francis explained. He created a network of safeguards to protect what he valued most about Westlake, its integrity. I carefully refolded the letter. I'll never know if I live up to his expectations, but I'll spend every day trying. You already have, Francis assured me. He hesitated, then asked the question that had clearly been troubling him. Those protection clauses, the ones that converted your shares upon termination, did Kenneth tell you they existed? I nodded. He insisted on them from the beginning, though I never believed they'd be necessary. The final revision was completed just 3 months before he died. He added language specifically addressing termination disguised as restructuring. As if he foresaw exactly what would happen, Francis marveled. I think he simply understood human nature, I replied, and he'd seen similar scenarios play out at other companies over his long career. There was a knock at the door, and Sheila entered with an update. I've sent security to your home, she said without preamble. They found evidence of tampering with your home office. Files missing, computer accessed. The security system had been disabled using Carl's code. My heart sank. The threat hadn't been empty after all. He was looking for something specific, I guessed. Probably evidence related to Artemis or the ownership agreements. Most likely, Sheila agreed. But we secured the critical documents weeks ago. Everything important is either with me or in safe deposit boxes. This was the advantage of having anticipated Carl's moves. We had protected the critical evidence long before he realized its importance. The ownership agreements, the original Artemis data, Kenneth's letters, all had been secured through Sheila's careful planning. Should we press charges? Francis asked grimly. I considered the question carefully. A criminal complaint would further damage Carl's reputation and potentially offer additional leverage in negotiations, but it would also escalate the conflict and generate exactly the kind of publicity Carl had threatened to create. Not yet, I decided. Let's focus on stabilizing the company first. We can address Carl's actions once the transition is secure. Sheila nodded approvingly. Strategic as always. Carl will expect immediate retaliation. When it doesn't come, he'll be off balance, wondering what you're planning instead. As we prepared to join the others, I reflected on the critical detail that had changed everything. The protection clause that Kenneth had insisted upon decades earlier. It had seemed like an unnecessary precaution at the time, a formal legal requirement with little practical relevance to our lives. How wrong I had been. That single clause, hidden within hundreds of pages of corporate documentation, had proven to be the foundation of everything that followed. Without it, Carl's plan to remove me would have succeeded. Westlake would be proceeding with the flawed Artemis submission, patients would be at risk, and the company's future would be compromised by shortcuts and ethical breaches. Kenneth had understood something fundamental that I had missed in my trust and optimism. Systems, not individuals, ultimately safeguard principles. His insistence on embedding ethical protections into the legal structure of Westlake had created a failsafe that activated precisely when needed. As we walked out to face the waiting executive team, I silently thanked Kenneth for his foresight. The journey ahead would be challenging, rebuilding Westlake's research protocols, addressing the Artemis issues transparently, managing the inevitable stock volatility, and navigating the personal aftermath of my collapsed marriage. But thanks to one critical detail in a decades-old agreement, I had the authority to ensure that journey would be guided by the principles upon which Westlake had been founded. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. The FDA disclosure was drafted, reviewed by legal, and submitted. The press release announcing Carl's resignation and my interim appointment was distributed to major news outlets. Key investors received personal calls from Francis explaining the situation in carefully measured terms. By early evening, I was exhausted, but knew the most difficult conversations still lay ahead. I had to face Carl directly, away from the boardroom and corporate politics. Our 25-year marriage deserved at least that much, a private reckoning before the public storm fully broke. I arranged to meet him at our home at 8 p.m. Sheila strongly objected, concerned about my safety after the break-in. At least let security wait outside, she insisted as we stood in my newly appointed CEO office, formerly Carl's space, now hastily cleared of his personal items. No, I replied firmly. This needs to be completely private, but I'll keep my phone on with the emergency contact ready. She reluctantly agreed, making me promise to check in every 30 minutes. As I drove home in the fading evening light, I reflected on how quickly everything had changed. Just yesterday, I had been Director of Community Relations, officially, terminated and clearing out my office. Now I was interim CEO, majority shareholder, and the public face of Westlake's ethical recommitment. The house looked exactly as I had left it that morning, though I knew from security's report that Carl had been inside, searching through my files. I parked in the driveway rather than the garage, ensuring my car would be visible from the street, a small precaution that Sheila would approve of. Carl arrived precisely at 8, driving the sleek black Mercedes he'd purchased after the Neurolex acquisition. Always punctual, even for difficult conversations. Some habits remained unchanged despite everything else that had shifted between us. He didn't use his key but rang the doorbell like a visitor. When I opened the door, the strain of the day was evident on his face, deeper lines around his eyes, a tightness to his mouth that I recognized from previous professional setbacks. "May I come in?" he asked formally, as if entering a stranger's home. I stepped aside wordlessly. He walked to the living room, taking in the familiar surroundings with an expression I couldn't quite read. Nostalgia, perhaps, or calculation. "Would you like a drink?" I offered, maintaining the strange civility between us. "No." He remained standing, refusing the pretense of casual conversation. "I came because you requested it, but I have nothing to say that wasn't already said in the boardroom." "I thought you might have questions," I said, taking a seat on the sofa. "About what happens next?" "You've made that abundantly clear," he replied, his voice cold. "My resignation has been announced, my key card deactivated, my emails redirected. 25 years dismantled in an afternoon, just as you planned to do to me," I observed quietly. He didn't deny it. "Business decisions require difficult choices. You understood that once." "I still do," I countered. "But there's a line between difficult choices and ethical breaches. The Artemis data manipulation crossed that line." Carl paced the room, agitation breaking through his controlled facade. The FDA submission would have succeeded. The side effects were manageable. Patients would have benefited from faster access to a breakthrough treatment. "Patients deserve informed consent based on accurate data," I replied. "You know that, Carl. You used to be the one insisting on complete transparency in clinical results." He stopped pacing, turning to face me directly. "What do you want from me, Alicia? An apology? Congratulations on your coup?" "What?" I met his gaze steadily. "I want to understand when it changed for you. When did results become more important than how we achieved them?" Something flickered in his eyes, a moment of genuine reflection before the defenses rose again. "It was gradual," he admitted finally. "After the cancer drug failure in 2010. When I watched 7 years of work amount to nothing because we were too cautious in the trial design, while competitors took shortcuts and got to market first." The pain in his voice was real. That failure had devastated him professionally and personally. I remembered holding him through sleepless nights as he grappled with the disappointment. "And Heather?" I asked, the question I'd avoided through all the corporate maneuvering. "When did that begin?" His expression hardened. "That's personal, not business." "It became business the moment you planned to announce your engagement at a board meeting," I pointed out. "The same day you terminated my employment." He had the grace to look momentarily ashamed. That was poorly handled. Yes, I agreed. Simply. It was. An uncomfortable silence stretched between us, 25 years of shared history hanging in the balance. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, the garden lights automatically illuminating the pathway I had designed when we first bought the house. "What do you want, Carl?" I asked finally. "Beyond recriminations and blame, what outcome are you hoping for now?" He seemed startled by the question, as if he hadn't considered options beyond fighting my takeover. For a moment, vulnerability replaced calculation in his expression. "I want my legacy intact," he answered with unexpected honesty. "I built Westlake from nothing. Whatever mistakes I've made recently don't erase 2 decades of achievements." It was the opening I had been waiting for, the moment when Carl's personal pride might allow for a resolution that didn't destroy everything we'd both worked to build. "Then perhaps," I said carefully, "we can find a path forward that preserves what matters most to both of us." Carl's expression shifted, suspicion replacing vulnerability. "What kind of path forward?" I gestured for him to sit. After a moment's hesitation, he took the armchair across from me, the same chair where he had sat countless evenings reviewing research papers while I worked on community outreach plans beside him on the sofa. "The FDA has already been notified. About the Artemis data issues," I began. "That can't be undone. But how the story unfolds from here, that we can still influence. You want to control the narrative," he observed, professional interest momentarily overriding his anger. "I want to protect what's worth protecting," I corrected. "Westlake's reputation for integrity can be restored. Your legacy as a researcher and founder can be preserved, separate from recent mistakes." Carl studied me carefully, trying to discern the trap he suspected. "At what cost?" "Your full cooperation with the FDA investigation," I replied. "Complete transparency about how and why the data was modified. No attempt to shift blame to lower-level researchers or regulatory staff." His eyes narrowed. "You're asking me to fall on my sword." "I'm asking you to take responsibility for your actions," I countered. "There's a difference. And in return, the company acknowledges your 25 years of contributions in all communications. Your research achievements remain highlighted in company materials. You retain the title of Founder Emeritus, and we establish a research grant in your name for autoimmune disease studies." It was more than a token offer. It was a chance for Carl to salvage his scientific reputation, even as his management ethics were questioned. The Carl who had once prioritized research integrity above all else might recognize the value of such a compromise. He was silent for a long moment, weighing the proposal against his alternatives. I could almost see the calculations running behind. His eyes, the likelihood of successfully fighting the board, the potential damage of a protracted public battle, the impact on his future in the industry. "And what about us?" he asked finally. 25 years of marriage dismissed as collateral damage? The question caught me off guard. Throughout the day's events, I had focused entirely on the corporate dimensions of Carl's betrayal, compartmentalizing the personal heartbreak of his affair with Heather. "I don't see a path forward for our marriage," I said quietly. "Not after everything that's happened." He nodded slightly, as if he'd expected the answer, but needed to hear it directly. "And Heather?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Her actions regarding the data deletion attempt are documented. Her future at Westlake is untenable," I replied. "Beyond that, your personal relationship with her is not my concern." Carl leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly. For the first time since the confrontation began, his defensive posture softened slightly. When he spoke again, his tone had lost some of its edge. "I should have known Kenneth would have protected you legally," he said. "He always saw potential in you that others missed." "Including you," I observed. Carl didn't deny it. "I came to see your community work as peripheral to the real business of pharmaceutical development." I was wrong. The admission, however small, surprised me. Carl rarely acknowledged mistakes, even in private. The Indonesian Health Ministry partnership alone brought in nearly $50 million in revenue last year, I pointed out. Hardly peripheral. I know, he acknowledged. I took credit for that in my presentation to the Barton Investment Group last quarter. The casual admission of how he had appropriated my work stung, even after everything else that had happened. But it also confirmed what I had long suspected. Carl had been systematically minimizing my contributions while highlighting his own. Your phone's buzzing, Carl noted, gesturing to my purse. I checked it quickly, a text from Sheila asking if I was all right. I sent a brief reply confirming I was fine. Your watchdog checking in? Carl asked with a hint of his old sarcasm. Just someone who cares about my well-being, I replied evenly. Something you seem to have forgotten about recently. He had the grace to look momentarily abashed. I never intended to harm you personally, Alicia. The termination was business, not— Don't, I interrupted. Don't pretend that firing me while planning to announce your engagement to Heather wasn't designed to humiliate me. You could have handled things a dozen different ways if you'd wanted to be humane. Carl fell silent, unable to defend the indefensible. Outside, a car door slammed, and we both tensed, the momentary detente broken by the reminder that others were involved in our conflict. That's probably Heather, Carl said, checking his watch. I told her I'd call after we spoke. The mention of Heather's name shifted the atmosphere in the room. Whatever brief connection we had reestablished dissolved, replaced by the reality of the triangle we now formed. You should consider my offer, I said, standing to indicate our conversation was ending. It's more generous than most boards would approve under the circumstances. Carl rose as well, maintaining the careful distance between us. I'll need to review it with my attorney. Of course, I agreed. Sheila will send the formal proposal tomorrow. As we walked to the door, Carl paused, looking around the home we had shared for so many years. What will you do with the house? I haven't decided, I answered honestly. There are too many memories here, both good and bad. He nodded, understanding what I meant. For a moment, I glimpsed the man I had married, thoughtful, perceptive, capable of empathy. It made the contrast with who he had become all the more painful. Kenneth would be proud of you, Carl said unexpectedly as he stepped onto the porch. Standing your ground, protecting the company, even at a personal cost. Before I could respond, he turned and walked to his car without looking back. I watched him drive away, realizing that his comment represented the first sign of a fundamental shift, an acknowledgement, however reluctant, that my actions had been justified. As I closed the door, I felt not triumph but a complex mixture of sadness and resolve. The confrontation was moving into a new phase, with Carl beginning to recognize the inevitability of the change I had initiated. By morning, the business world was buzzing with news of the leadership change at Westlake Pharmaceuticals. Financial. Analysts speculated about the reasons behind Carl's abrupt resignation, while industry insiders traded rumors about the Artemis submission issues. I arrived at the office early, determined to set the tone for Westlake's new direction. The executive floor felt different, energized yet anxious, as employees navigated the uncertain terrain of new leadership. At 9:30, Sheila arrived for our scheduled meeting, bringing with her a thick folder of documents and a concerned expression. Carl's attorney reached out, she said without preamble as she closed my office door. He's requesting all research data related to the modified Artemis formulation that Dr. Winters presented yesterday. I nodded, unsurprised. And he's claiming it belongs to Westlake and therefore falls under Carl's ongoing patent rights. As the original researcher, this was the move I had anticipated, Carl attempting to maintain control over Artemis even after his departure. His scientific ego wouldn't allow him to relinquish the breakthrough treatment that was supposed to be his crowning achievement. What's our position? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Sheila smiled slightly. The modified formulation was developed independently by researchers who were no longer Westlake employees at the time, using knowledge they had prior to their departures. Carl's patent claims extend to the original formulation only. Let me guess. There's documentation proving this timeline? Meticulous documentation, Sheila confirmed. Dr. Winters anticipated this exact scenario. Every research session was recorded, dated, and witnessed by independent parties. The intellectual property is clean. This was the final piece of my strategy, the element Carl hadn't seen coming. While he had been focused on maintaining control through corporate maneuvering, I had been building an alternative path for Artemis that bypassed his authority entirely. What does Carl's lawyer say about our counterproposal? I asked, referring to the compromise I had offered the previous evening. They're considering it, Sheila replied, but Carl is pushing for more, specifically ongoing royalties from any Artemis formulation, modified or original. I shook my head. Not possible. The ethics violations would make that untenable with the board. My phone buzzed with a text. It was from Carl. We need to talk. Your office. 15 minutes. I showed it to Sheila, who frowned. He shouldn't even be in the building. His access was revoked. Francis probably let him in, I guessed. They've been friends for 30 years. Sure enough, 15 minutes later, Carl arrived at my office door, escorted by a clearly uncomfortable Francis. Carl looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept. The confident executive from yesterday was gone, replaced by a man finally confronting the full consequences of his actions. Carl has asked for a brief meeting, Francis explained, his tone apologetic. I took responsibility for his building access. I nodded, gesturing for Carl to enter. It's fine, Francis. We'll be brief. As Francis left, closing the door behind him, Carl stood in the center of the office, taking in the changes I had already made to the space. Family photos removed, his awards relocated, my own materials arranged on the desk that had been his just 24 hours earlier. I've reviewed the Artemis documentation, he said without preamble. The modified formulation, the research protocols, the independent development timeline. I waited, allowing him to continue. It's brilliant work, he admitted, his scientists' appreciation temporarily overriding his wounded pride. And completely beyond my legal reach. This was it, the complete revelation of just how thoroughly his position had been undermined. Not just corporate authority and ownership stakes, but the very research he considered his scientific legacy. You didn't just plan for my attempt to remove you, he said, realization dawning in his expression. You created an entirely parallel research track that I couldn't touch. For the first time since our confrontation began, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. Precisely. 3 months after the boardroom confrontation, Westlake Pharmaceuticals had found its new equilibrium. The initial stock drop following our FDA disclosure had been significant, but not catastrophic, down 23% in the first week before stabilizing, as investors recognized our proactive approach. The modified Artemis formulation had been submitted as an amendment to our original application, with the FDA expressing cautious appreciation for our transparency. The review timeline had been extended by 6 months, but early feedback suggested eventual approval was likely. I stood at the window of the CEO's office, my office now, though I still thought of it as temporary, watching employees cross the campus courtyard below. The autumn leaves were beginning to turn, nature's reminder that change was constant and often beautiful. A knock at the door interrupted my reflection. Genevieve from marketing entered, carrying presentation materials for our upcoming investor conference. The quarterly projections are finalized, she reported, setting the folder on my desk. Ian says we'll exceed expectations despite the Artemis delay. The Indonesian contract extension more than made up the difference. Excellent, I nodded. And the revised messaging about Carl's consultant role? Completed as directed, she confirmed. We've positioned him as the pioneering researcher whose early work made Artemis possible, while highlighting Dr. Winter's team contributions to the improved formulation. The compromise with Carl had been finalized 2 weeks after our confrontation. He had accepted the Founder Emeritus title and a limited consulting arrangement focused solely on historical research projects, with no management authority or access to current development data. The arrangement preserved his scientific legacy while keeping him at a safe distance from operations. Has there been any feedback from the press about Carl and Heather? I asked. Genevieve hesitated, clearly uncomfortable discussing my personal situation. Some gossip in industry publications, but it's dying down. Their relocation to Boston has helped reduce local interest. Carl and Heather had indeed moved to Boston, where she had secured a position with a smaller biotech firm. While the industry was too small for their actions to go completely unnoticed, the geographical distance had allowed the personal drama to fade from immediate attention. After Genevieve left, I reviewed the day's schedule. The search committee for a permanent CEO was meeting that afternoon, a process I had insisted on despite the board's suggestion that I remain in the role permanently. While I had discovered unexpected satisfaction in leading Westlake through its crisis, my talents and interests remained more aligned with strategic relationships and ethical oversight than day-to-day executive functions. My phone buzzed with a text from Sheila. Divorce papers finalized. Carl signed without amendments. Closing this chapter for you. A wave of mixed emotions washed over me. Relief, sadness, and finally, a sense of freedom. The legal dissolution of my 25-year marriage felt strangely anticlimactic after the professional separation had been so dramatic. I texted back a simple, "Thank you for everything." Later that afternoon, I walked across campus to the research building where Dr. Winters had established her team in newly renovated laboratories. The space hummed with purposeful energy, researchers moving between workstations with the focused intensity that had characterized Westlake in its early days. The cellular response data looks promising, Dr. Winters reported as she showed me their latest results. The modified delivery system is reducing liver accumulation by nearly 60% compared to the original formulation. Patient outcomes with fewer side effects, I observed. Exactly what we should have prioritized from the beginning. Science done right takes time, she replied with the wisdom of her decades in research. Shortcuts only create longer delays. In the end. As I left the laboratory, I passed the wall where we had recently installed a simple plaque commemorating Kenneth Westlake's founding principles. Science in service of patients. Ethics in service of science. A daily reminder of the values that had nearly been lost in the pursuit of faster approvals and higher stock prices. Outside, the company campus stretched before me. Buildings that housed nearly 600 employees, working on treatments that would help thousands of patients. The institution was larger than any individual, more enduring than any single product or leadership team. In the end, that was what I had fought to protect. Not just my position or pride, but the integrity of something worth preserving. Whatever personal price I had paid seemed a fair exchange for that accomplishment. 6 months after the boardroom revelation, I found myself back at the Preston Hotel, the venue where Carl had planned to celebrate his promotion and engagement announcement. The irony wasn't lost on me as I waited in the private dining room where pharmaceutical industry leaders had gathered for the annual Innovation Awards. Westlake had been nominated for the Ethics in Research Award, a recognition of our transparent handling of the Artemis data issues and our commitment to patient safety over expedited approvals. The nomination itself was a victory, proof that our industry valued integrity even when it came at a financial cost. I smoothed the fabric of my navy blue dress, chosen carefully for this evening where I would likely encounter Carl for the first time since the divorce was finalized. As interim CEO, I would represent Westlake while the search for my permanent replacement continued. The cocktail hour buzzed with conversation around me, executives and researchers networking in the carefully choreographed dance of industry relationships. I was engaged in a discussion with the FDA's Associate Commissioner when I sensed a familiar presence behind me. "Congratulations on the nomination," Carl said as I turned to face him. "Well deserved." He looked different, more rested than during our last encounter. The sharp edges of bitterness somewhat softened. Boston apparently agreed with him. "Thank you," I replied, genuinely surprised by his gracious tone. "I didn't expect to see you here." "The Research Innovation Committee still wanted my input," he explained with a small shrug. "Some things are hard to give up entirely." The Associate Commissioner discreetly excused herself, leaving us in a momentary bubble of privacy despite the crowded room. "How is the Artemis review progressing?" Carl asked, his scientific curiosity evidently undiminished. "Phase 3 data is strong," I answered. "The modified formulation is showing efficacy equal to the original with significantly reduced hepatic markers. FDA seems cautiously optimistic." He nodded, professional satisfaction briefly visible in his expression. "And Heather? Any issues with her departure package?" "All settled according to the agreement," I assured him. The severance had been generous despite the circumstances, another component of the compromise that had allowed for a clean break. An awkward silence fell between us, 25 years of shared history, making small talk impossible but deeper conversation too painful. "I saw the announcement about the Kenneth Westlake Foundation," Carl said finally. "The scholarship program for women in pharmaceutical research is a fitting tribute." "It was Kenneth's idea originally," I acknowledged. "One of many suggestions in his letters that we're finally implementing." Carl's expression turned reflective. He saw things more clearly than the rest of us, especially me. The simple admission, so contrary to Carl's usual reluctance to acknowledge mistakes, caught me off guard. Before I could respond, the dinner. Chimes rang, signaling guests to find their tables. "I should go," Carl said. "I'm seated with the Boston delegation." As he turned to leave, he hesitated, then added quietly, "For what it's worth, Alicia, you were right. About everything. The data, the company, us." He met my eyes directly. I lost sight of why we started all this in the first place. The simple acknowledgement, delivered without expectation or agenda, felt like the closing of a circle begun 26 years ago when an idealistic scientist knocked on my office door. "We both built something worthwhile," I replied. "That doesn't disappear, even if we couldn't sustain everything else." He nodded once, accepting the measured reconciliation I offered. Not forgiveness exactly, but a recognition of the complex truth of our shared history. "Goodbye, Alicia," he said simply, then turned and walked toward his table on the other side of the room. I watched him go, feeling a weight lift that I hadn't fully acknowledged was still there. The personal chapter was truly closing now, not with bitterness or triumph, but with the quiet dignity of mutual recognition. Later that evening, when Westlake was announced as the Ethics in Research Award winner, I accepted the Crystal Trophy. With a speech that acknowledged all who had contributed to restoring the company's ethical foundation. I did not name Carl specifically, but I included a line about the pioneering research that made our treatments possible. A small acknowledgement of the scientist he had once been, separate from the executive he had become. As I returned to my seat, award in hand, I caught his eye across the room. He raised his glass slightly, a gesture between former partners who had built something significant, lost their way, and found separate paths forward. I returned the gesture, then turned my attention to the colleagues surrounding me, the present and future of Westlake Pharmaceuticals, now restored to its founding principles. 1 year to the day after Carl and Heather had attempted to fire me, I stood at the podium in Westlake's main auditorium, addressing the assembled employees. The company had changed significantly in those 12 months. New leadership, renewed focus on research integrity, and a corporate culture that valued ethical decision-making over expedited timelines. Today marks my final day as interim CEO, I announced to the gathered staff. The board has selected Dr. Olivia Winters as my successor, effective tomorrow morning. Applause erupted throughout the room. Dr. Winters' appointment represented the perfect synthesis of scientific expertise and ethical leadership, exactly what Westlake needed to move forward. Under Dr. Winters' guidance, Westlake will continue prioritizing patient outcomes over quarterly projections, I continued. The modified Artemis formulation, now approved for treatment of 3 autoimmune conditions, stands as testament to what we can achieve when we honor our founding principles. As I concluded my remarks, I touched the small silver pin on my lapel, Kenneth's personal logo that he had given to those he considered part of his inner circle. I had found it among his effects after his death, with a note asking that I wear it when the time is right. Today felt like that time. Later, in the privacy of my office, soon to be Dr. Winters' office, I completed the final task of my interim leadership. I signed the documents establishing my new role, chairperson of the Ethics Oversight Committee, with a permanent board seat and authority to review all research protocols and corporate decisions for alignment with Westlake's core values. It wasn't the community relations position I had once held, nor the CEO role I had temporarily assumed. It was something more fitting, a position that would allow me to be the company's conscience, just as Kenneth had once described me. Francis knocked gently on my open door. "Car's ready whenever you are," he said. "The movers finished at the lake house this morning." I nodded, gathering my personal items into a small box. I had sold the colonial home Carl and I had shared, choosing instead the lakeside property that had always been my personal sanctuary. The fresh start felt appropriate as I closed this chapter of my professional life. "Any regrets?" Francis asked as we walked toward the elevator. I considered the question carefully. The past year had brought professional triumph alongside personal loss, the end of my marriage, the stress of corporate restructuring, the scrutiny of industry observers watching Westlake's every move. "No regrets," I answered honestly. Some sadness for what couldn't be saved, but pride in what was. As we drove away from Westlake's campus, I looked back at the buildings silhouetted against the setting sun. What had begun as a personal betrayal, my husband and his secretary firing me, had catalyzed something unexpected, the reclamation of an institution's soul and the discovery of my own strength. The company would continue its work long after all of us were gone. Patients would benefit from treatments developed with integrity rather than expediency. And somewhere, I like to think Kenneth was watching, satisfied that his faith in me had been justified. Sometimes the greatest victories come disguised as defeats. And sometimes, being underestimated is the most powerful advantage of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.